Welcome to our channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our spooky stories. It was a cold and damp night when the group of tourists arrived at the Wax Museum, an old and imposing building situated on the outskirts of the city. The museum's facade, illuminated by a faint and yellowish light, exuded an air of decay and mystery. The guide, a middle-aged man with dark eyes and an enigmatic smile, waited at the entrance, ready to lead them through the night exhibitions. "A welcome to the Museum of Horrors," he said in a deep voice that resonated through the cold night air. "This place holds dark stories and secrets that go beyond comprehension. Please, follow me and stay together. We don't want anyone getting lost in here." The group, composed of 7 people, entered cautiously. There was a young couple, a businessman who seemed to constantly check his watch, 2 friends whispering nervously, and an art student with a notebook in hand. They passed through a heavy wooden door that creaked as it opened, revealing the dark and stuffy interior of the museum. Inside, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The air was still, and the smell of wax and dust was almost suffocating. The wax figures, arranged in various scenes along the narrow corridors, were eerily realistic. Each figure seemed captured in a moment of suffering or terror, with facial expressions frozen in silent screams and eyes that seemed to follow every movement of the visitors. The guide began to tell stories about some of the most notorious figures, recounting urban legends and macabre historical events with unsettling precision. Each narrative seemed to bring forth a bit more of the darkness that permeated the place. The tourists, initially curious, began to feel a growing discomfort. The sensation of being watched was palpable, and nearly inaudible whispers seemed to emanate from the very walls. As they advanced, the atmosphere grew heavier. Shadows danced strangely on the walls, and the eyes of the wax figures seemed to glow with their own light. One of the friends pointed to a particular figure, a woman in a period dress, her eyes filled with despair. Did she move?" The other friend laughed nervously, but the group's unease grew. The guide led them to a central room where a huge wax figure depicted an ancient ritual. "This is one of our most intriguing pieces," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A legend has it that this ritual was used to imprison human souls in the wax figures. Of course, these are just stories, or maybe not." The group exchanged uneasy glances. The light seemed to flicker, and a cold draft swept through the room, sending a chill down everyone's spine. Little did they know that this was just the introduction to the horrors they were about to face. The tourists proceeded down the narrow, dark corridor, following the guide who seemed to glide through the shadows with unsettling familiarity. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly against the stone walls, heightening the sense of isolation. They entered the first exhibition room, where soft lights revealed wax figures in bizarre and disturbing poses. The first rooms were dedicated to historical scenes. There was a medieval monarch with a look of despair on his face, surrounded by advisors who seemed on the verge of betraying him. Further along, a representation of a witch trial showed a young woman tied to a stake, her wax eyes fixed in eternal fear. The scenes were so detailed and realistic that it was hard to believe the figures were only made of wax. Every movement of the group seemed to awaken a growing sense of unease. The guide stopped in front of a particularly horrifying figure. A man dressed in Victorian attire, with eyes that seemed alive and an expression of agony. This figure," the guide explained, "is based on a man who mysteriously disappeared in the 19th century. Some say he was the museum's first victim. One of the tourists, the art student, approached the figure to observe the details. Incredible how it looks so real," he murmured, tracing the contours of the figure's face with his finger. The guide smiled enigmatically, watching the group with a disconcerting intensity. As the group advanced, the corridors seemed to narrow, and the lighting became increasingly dim. The feeling of being watched intensified. Nearly imperceptible whispers filled the air, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. The young couple walked closer together, while the two friends frequently looked back, as if expecting to see something horrible following them. Suddenly, one of the glass doors separating the exhibition slammed shut with a loud bang, making everyone jump. The guide, apparently unfazed, simply said, "Don't worry, the museum has a life of its own sometimes. Keep following me." They entered a room that seemed older and more worn than the previous ones. The wax figures here were in advanced states of deterioration. Their expressions were of pure terror, as if frozen at the moment of their deaths. One figure in particular caught their attention. A man in a military uniform, with wide eyes and an open mouth in a silent scream. When one of the tourists passed by, he had the impression that the figure's head moved slightly. Did you see that?" he asked the businessman, looking nervously at the guide. The guide just smiled, a smile that offered no comfort. There are things in this museum that defy logic and reason," the guide replied. Sometimes, old stories have more truth than we are willing to believe." The group continued, but the feeling of discomfort and fear only grew. Little did they know that the night was just beginning, and the horrors lurking in the museum's shadows were yet to be revealed. As they advanced through the increasingly dark corridors, the tourists began to realize that something was terribly wrong. The air grew colder, and a thin mist began to rise from the floor, enveloping their feet in a chilling haze. The whispers became more audible, as if dozens of voices were trying to warn them of imminent danger. Suddenly, a wax statue representing a medieval soldier fell to the floor with a loud crash, its arms separating from the body and rolling to the feet of one of the friends. She screamed, but the guide just raised an eyebrow and murmured something about a realistic special effects. They entered another room where the wax figures seemed more alive than ever. Here, a group of figures was arranged in a masquerade ball scene. The wax faces, covered by intricate masks, had an almost ethereal quality. As the group watched, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the figures moved in sync, turning their heads toward the visitors. This can't be real," whispered the businessman, his face pale and sweating. But before anyone could respond, a low, sinister laugh echoed through the hall, as if someone was amused by their fear. The tourists began to panic. The art student, trying to stay calm, suggested that maybe it was part of the museum experience, a form of immersive theater. But the guide, his smile now completely gone, looked directly into the student's eyes. "You need to understand," he said slowly, "this museum has a history that goes beyond what anyone can imagine. There are souls here that have never found rest." As he spoke, one of the friends felt a cold touch on her shoulder. She turned quickly, but no one was there, just another wax figure with a vacant, fixed stare. Her heart raced, and she felt the walls closing in around her. The group moved on, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The wax figures seemed more animated, and the whispers turned into audible moans. The young couple held hands tightly, trying to find comfort in each other, but the fear was palpable in their eyes. They reached a fork in the museum's corridors, and the guide stopped, looking at both paths with a thoughtful gaze.
This is a critical point, he said.
One path leads to the exit. The other, well, few who have taken that path have returned to tell the tale. Before they could decide, the lights flickered again, and a cutting chill swept through the group. The nearby wax figures seemed to move once more, their eyes now clearly following the visitors. A sound of something heavy dragging along the floor echoed from the dark corridors, slowly approaching. We need to get out of here now. One of the friends shouted, her voice full of panic. But when they tried to move, they realized the doors they had passed were now inexplicably locked. They were trapped, with the entire museum turning against them, each wax figure a potential threat. The reality of their danger began to sink in completely, and the only hope left was to trust the guide, whose intentions were increasingly questionable. The terror they felt was no longer a mere sensation. It was a certainty that something truly evil was lurking in the shadows of the Museum of Horrors. The atmosphere in the museum transformed into a palpable nightmare. The group of tourists was trapped in a labyrinth of corridors that seemed to stretch and contort under the flickering light of the lamps. The tension increased with each step, with the whispers turning into distant screams and moans of agony. They were being hunted, and the threat became clearer with each moment. The wax figures were no longer static. With slow, sinister movements, they began to close in, encircling the group. One of the tourists, the businessman, saw a wax figure representing a circus clown. When he blinked, the clown was a few inches closer, with a malicious smile forming on its wax lips. This can't be happening, he murmured, but reality was beyond any logic. The group ran, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the dark corridors. Every door they tried was locked, every window blocked. The feeling of despair grew as the wax figures followed them, their vacant, deadly stares fixed on the tourists. The art student tried to stay calm, suggesting that if they found the curator's office, they might find a key or an emergency exit. As they ran, a horrible sound of scratching and dragging followed them, as if something waxy was moving heavily behind them. One of the friends stumbled and fell, and before she could get up, a wax figure of an ancient samurai warrior was over her, its sword raised in a threatening gesture. The young couple screamed, pulling her away just in time, but the sword fell, cutting through the air with a chilling sound. What do we do now? The art student shouted, his voice desperate. The guide, still with them but now clearly terrified, pointed to a door at the end of the corridor. There, it's our only chance. They ran to the door, but as they reached it, a massive wax figure representing a grotesque, deformed man blocked the way. His eyes were empty but filled with inhuman malice. He reached out, and the tourists could see the disturbing details: dirty, cracked nails, wax skin melted with deep scars. The young couple tried to push the figure, but it was as if it was glued to the floor. Desperation took over, and the friend who had fallen began to cry, pleading for their lives. At that moment, the guide, with a spark of determination, grabbed a candelabra from a nearby table and threw it at the figure, breaking it into pieces.
Let's go quickly, he shouted.
They went through the door, entering a new room full of old documents and bizarre artifacts. In the center, an old desk with scattered papers and a rusty key. The art student grabbed the key, but before they could move, a wax figure representing an alchemist rose, its eyes glowing with indescribable hatred. What is this? The businessman asked, his voice full of fear. The guide responded, These are the museum's guardians. They protect the secrets and souls trapped here. If we don't leave now, we'll be the next to become part of this macabre collection. The battle for survival began. The group fought against the wax figures that seemed to emerge from the shadows, each more horrendous and aggressive than the last. Time was running out, and their only hope of escape depended on their courage and determination to face the living horrors of the Museum of Horrors. Amidst the confusion and terror, the tourists realized that the rusty key might be their only chance to escape. The art student, still holding the key with trembling hands, looked around frantically, searching for any sign of an exit. Meanwhile, the wax figures seemed to be reorganizing, as if guided by an invisible force. The guide, now showing signs of panic, searched the desk for clues. Among the old and dusty documents, he found a grimoire covered in arcane symbols. Here it is, he said, his voice full of urgency. This book contains the answer to breaking the curse that traps the souls here. The group gathered around the guide, who began flipping through the yellowed pages of the grimoire. He found an ancient ritual that could free the souls trapped in the wax figures, but it required a sacrifice. The young couple looked at each other, understanding the weight of this revelation. As someone has to stay, the guide said, his voice trembling. As someone must volunteer to distract the figures while the others perform the ritual. Silence fell over the group as everyone processed this terrible truth. Then the businessman, who had until now seemed more interested in leaving than in helping, stepped forward. I'll do it, he said, with a new determination in his eyes. I've never had a family or true friends. Maybe this is the only way to give my life some meaning. Before anyone could dissuade him, he picked up the broken candelabrum and positioned himself at the entrance of the room, ready to face the wax figures. Go. Perform the ritual and get out of here, he ordered, his voice firm. The others nodded, acknowledging the courage in his gesture. The guide began reciting the ancient words from the grimoire, while the art student and his friends drew the symbols on the floor with chalk. The young couple held hands, providing each other with strength and comfort. The wax figures began to move again, drawn to the sound of the ritual, and the businessman attacked, keeping them at bay with the candelabrum. Each second felt like an eternity. The words of the ritual echoed through the room, mixing with the screams and sounds of battle. The businessman's sacrifice seemed to buy them enough time. The grimoire began to glow with a supernatural light, and the guide held it high, uttering the final phrase of the enchantment. A wave of energy swept through the museum, causing the wax figures to stop in mid-motion. The lights flickered violently, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the figures began to melt, as if intense heat were dissolving the wax they were made of. The souls trapped within them were freed, their spectral forms ascending into the air with a soft glow before vanishing. But the businessman, exhausted and wounded, fell to the ground. The couple rushed to him, but it was too late. With his last breath, he whispered, "You succeeded. Get out now." His eyes closed, and he lay still. The group, still shaken, took the rusty key and ran to the exit. They traversed now empty corridors, free from the wax figures that had once haunted them. When they reached the main door, the key turned with a satisfying click. The door opened, and they stepped out into the cold night air, feeling the weight of the Museum of Horrors finally lift from their shoulders. But the memory of the businessman's sacrifice and the horrors they faced would never leave them. They had survived, but they knew that the nightmares of the museum would live with them forever. The cold night air enveloped them as they left the museum, but the initial relief was quickly replaced by a sense of emptiness and sadness for the businessman's sacrifice. They walked in silence to the parking lot, each lost in their own thoughts. The fog seemed to dissipate, and the starry sky appeared a distant and indifferent consolation to the trials they had endured. When they reached their cars, the guide who had led them was no longer with them. He had disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving only the old grimoire as proof of his presence. The art student held the book with reverence, aware of the power and danger it contained. We need to destroy this, he said, his voice firm. We can't let anyone else go through what we did. The young couple and the friends agreed, but they knew the task would be difficult. They decided that the best way to ensure everyone's safety would be to burn the book. They found an old metal barrel in the parking lot, and using a lighter one of them carried, they started a fire. The grimoire began to burn, its pages twisting and crackling with a bluish, supernatural flame. As they watched the book burn, the sense of danger seemed to lessen, but a persistent unease remained. The guide and the museum were still there, and who knew how many others could be drawn by the promise of a frightening night tour. They decided that at dawn, they would alert the authorities and do their best to close the museum for good. When the fire finally died down, leaving only ashes, the group returned to their cars, still shaken but determined to move on. The young couple decided they would marry soon, not letting fear separate them. The friends promised to support each other, knowing that the shared experience had created an unbreakable bond among them. The art student, now with a new purpose, vowed to tell the story of what they had been through, warning others about the hidden dangers in seemingly innocent places. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal for the survivors. But on nights of deep silence, each of them still felt the presence of the trapped souls from the museum. In their dreams, the wax figures continued to haunt them, their eyes filled with pain and desperation. The psychological scars were deep, and the weight of the experience would never completely disappear. One night, while the art student worked in his studio, he heard a familiar sound, a faint whisper, like a wax figure coming to life. Turning slowly, he saw a shadow move out of the corner of his eye. His instinct screamed at him not to look, but fear paralyzed him. When he finally turned around, he found only his own reflection in the mirror, but the cold he felt in his spine was unmistakable. The phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was one of the friends, her voice trembling and anxious. You felt it too, didn't you? She asked. I thought we were free, but it seems the museum hasn't completely let us go. The others had also begun to sense the presence, as if something from the museum was still connected to them. They gathered once more, deciding they needed to confront what remained of their experiences. They returned to the spot where they had burned the grimoire and discovered that the ashes had disappeared, and on the ground, carved into the stone, was the symbol of the ritual they had performed.
What does this mean? He asked the young couple, frightened.
The art student, looking at the symbol, realized that the battle was far from over. We freed the souls, but we didn't break the curse. The museum still holds secrets, and maybe we'll never be completely free. With this new understanding, they knew they would have to keep watch, not just for themselves, but for others who might be drawn to the Museum of Horrors. The curse was a persistent shadow, a constant reminder that true terror never completely disappears. And as they lived their lives, there was always a glance over the shoulder, an ear attuned to whispers from the shadows, reminding them that fear, once awakened, never sleeps again.